Dr. Feuerborn. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Pet Buzz.
Thanks for having me.
Why do we use dogs to understand human movement, like migration and trade interaction?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's definitely something that's been kind of increasing over the last couple of years that we've had a lot more research that have been using this kind of perspective. And I believe for me, and I think that's because of my background in archaeology, that I have a pretty good explanation for this. And that's that, humans and dogs have had really interconnected histories. We've both been tied to each other from the beginning of dogs, really, because dogs were the first domesticates. So for so many thousands of years, humans and dogs have done so much together because you can't have a dog without a human, right? Because they're domesticated species. They don't just run around in the wild. Now we see that a little bit more so with free roaming dogs, but inherently, where there's a person, there's probably a dog. And where there's a dog, there's almost definitely a person. And because of this, they help to fill in the gaps that sometimes we have with human remains or human materials from archaeological sites. There's not always these pieces of data that we can get through humans, but where you have a dog, most likely you have a representative of what was probably happening in the human population at the same time.
It's kind of like that closeness in the way that we live, since they live so close to us, meaning either in the same building or near us.
Exactly.
Right?
Why have dogs in the Arctic been considered a valuable commodity for many thousands of years, including today?
Well, in the Arctic, dogs are an intrinsic part of human technology, not just human society, but they're actually a piece of technology, right? So if you think about dogs pulling sleds, they're not only a pet, but they're a tool in that way. And I think that's why they've been so valuable, because they play this intrinsic role in human society. And while we don't know the exact emotional or monetary value of dogs in the past, what we can see that there's clear evidence for their kind of interconnected lives and this kind of inherent value that they would have had, whether it was through hunting or through pulling a sled or as a resource during times of hardship. These kinds of elements have made them very, very useful to humans. While we don't know exactly what price they would have put on them in the past, this has been a big part of it.
You know what I find so interesting? So there are all these shows about people living in Alaska alone, and all these shows on Discovery, and you still see the way these people live, very isolated, up in the Arctic. And what I find so interesting is so many times you see them having snowmobiles, and the snowmobiles break down. So a lot of times these people still use dogs to move around, whether it's to compete or whether it's to hunt or whether it's to forage or carry. So dogs are still a really important part in life in this present society, which when you think about a study like this, these people still live an isolated life to a certain extent, out in the wild, but they still really have to rely on these dogs because technology is not always foolproof. So that's, I think, for me, one of the one of the threads between the work that Dr. Feuerborn is doing and how people are living today in some of those same areas.
Seems like we always talk about the Arctic. We don't talk about beach areas or the southern part of the hemisphere. Is that correct?
It is to some degree. But I think part of that, at least from this kind of ancient DNA perspective that I'm working in, that's partly just because of the preservation of DNA. It's much, much better in the Arctic than it is in desert or beach environments. But also, they haven't played the same kind of intrinsic technological role in other societies too, right? So you can get by at the beach without a dog, but can you get by in the Arctic without one?
Don't fall for his tricks. He just came from Michigan and really hates the cold weather. Actually, I'm surprised he doesn't have a sweater on because it's actually cold. I think it's below 75 today. Okay.
Yeah.
So getting back to our interview. So taking a step further, why is it believed that dogs and their Arctic people have been completely isolated from the rest of the world? What has made us believe that?
So it isn't that all Arctic people have been completely isolated, but in general, they have been. Kind of throughout time, it's been a little bit variable. And of course, the contact is varied by culture, by geography, or just across time, right? So there would have been pockets of time that there would have been some contact and others not. And in some regions there would be, in some regions there wouldn't be. but it's, I think, largely just because of the geographical isolation. Siberia was a big swath of land. Same thing with the North American Arctic. It's a big area and it's such an extreme climate. So if you don't have to be there, I guess kind of like Dr. Fleck, right? If you don't like the cold, you're not going to go there. So if you don't have a reason to be there, you're not going to be there. So there wasn't huge scale like human migration that was frequently happening in the Arctic. And then it's this kind of research into modern human genetics that's detected this very little contact, genetic contact, that is, between the Arctic populations and populations outside of the Arctic. So that's where this is rooted in, this idea that they didn't have much contact. But yeah, why would you be there if you didn't have to be there, or if you didn't have the skill set to be there, right?
What changed this theory that these communities have been so isolated?
From the archaeological evidence over the last couple of years in Siberia, there's been the recovery of various different materials, and some of this being things like glass beads that look like they're from outside of Siberia. So there's been this hint that there's been contact in the region, despite what the human genetics tell us. And so instead of it being a change of theory, it's almost like a bridge between two different theories, one saying there was no contact and another one saying that there was contact. And what our research has been able to see with these dog genomes is that there was contact, but it wasn't genetic contact of people, right? So that both things were true at the same time. And what was happening is that people were in some way in contact with other people, whether that was migrating and trading and going back, but they just weren't trading partners themselves, right? So you're not finding a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a partner, a wife. I mean, these terms wouldn't have been used in the past, right? But you're not necessarily breeding with these other populations. So you're not going to see that in the human genetics. But if you do come into contact, you might get some beads from them, you might get some tools from them, and that's coming back to the Arctic with you. But so there's these two different stories, but that doesn't mean they're not both true at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about your research. I mean, how did you conduct it? Like, what was the protocols?
So what we do, generally speaking, is we get materials from archaeologists that are actually digging out in the dirt, out in the permafrost. And so we get dog bones from them most of the time. And so then we're able to drill a small sample of that and extract DNA from it in these kind of specialized lab setups. Or some of my samples even came from parkas or other items of clothing that were actually made from dog fur at times. And so we're able to kind of get snapshot views of what dogs were like in the past through the DNA from either their bones or from the DNA found in their fur, to pinpoint kind of at one given moment what they might have looked like in the past.
Just so our listeners and I can understand this more, when you're taking your DNA samples, it's from the remains of the canines?
Correct.
Is that, and what they'd be associated with? You just mentioned the foods.
No, I thought you said clothing. Like, yeah, people used like the rest of the dogs like fur to make hats and things like that.
So your DNA would be of all of those articles as well as the dog remains?
Correct.
I'm assuming that some of the gene pool in these dogs were kind of a combo of the Siberian dogs and some of the other Eastern European or lower landmass dogs, like Asiatic, like lower Asiatic dogs, correct?
Exactly. So that's what we were able to find.
Well, let me help out a little bit more on this too. So we do the DNA on the canine, and it relates to, so that all of our listeners can understand, like me, and it relates to people's movement, or what does that mean?
So essentially what we're looking at when we are kind of trying to address these questions is we take the genome of the dog that we're looking at and we just compare it to other dogs, whether it's in the past or in the present. So sometimes we don't have the best proxy in the past or the best equivalent in the past, right? If we haven't sequenced it yet, we don't have that data. So we'll have to use a modern dog from whatever region. So maybe a modern dog that's been living last year in China, or a dog 10,000 years ago that we could find in the high Arctic. But we compare our samples of interest, our dogs of interest, and we look at how many of the genes or how much of the DNA is shared between these different populations, if that makes sense. And so you can kind of put a percentage to it and say 10% of them came from here and 90% came from here, or 100% looks like this one 5,000 years before them. And so they're the same for all intents and purposes, they're the same, right? So we can look at those kind of more minute or general differences to kind of sense a pattern of what's going on.
So you got the pattern of the development of the canine and the movement,
Yes.
is that compatible with the movement and the development of the human?
So in the sense that we don't see the humans interacting genetically with each other outside of the region. So it's a little bit incongruous at that stage, or it kind of doesn't match up, but it does match up with the archaeological records. So when we see that there's materials moving, which means that people and their dogs probably moved, they didn't take a new partner from this new place. But if their dog was feeling a little frisky while they were there, and they had some free time of their own, and then you bring your dog back, and a couple months later she has puppies, and the father of these puppies was not from the same group, right? Then you're going to start getting these signals of this kind of different ancestry in the dogs. Or a different scenario could be that they actually picked up a brand new dog wherever they went. They picked up their beads, they picked up a new dog and brought it back with them.
Right.
That both of these scenarios could have happened.
So you've had your aha moment. So it's not only comparing and contrasting the dogs and the dog samples over a period of time, it's also comparing the dog genetic mixing with the fact that these people did not mix with other people.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. So all brought together by the close proximity of how they live together.
Mm-hmm.
So really it's about the migratory patterns and the trade network in conjunction with the DNA of the dogs and the people.
Right.
Okay.
In snow-covered land.
And so, okay. So we're going to move on. So, okay. So I guess really, I mean, at the end of the day, now that you've got it, Dr. Fleck, now, you know, now let's think fast forward, let's think to the future. So what can, I guess, current day pet owners take away from this research in accordance to how we live today? Does that mean my dog in his Halloween costume is going to tell people about how I lived with him? Like I dressed up my dog for
Almost
Halloween.
certainly. Yes, I think so. I mean, that's a great question in general. And to me, there's two different kind of elements. One is that we can directly say that dogs like the Siberian Husky and the Samoyed and other Siberian dog breeds still have a significant portion of their ancestry from these early Siberian dogs. So like they are an ancient breed, right? At least in part. So I think that's pretty fascinating. So if anybody that has a Siberian Husky at home, you can look at that dog and know, man, you've been doing what you've been doing for a really long time, which I think is pretty fascinating. And then the second is that while dogs maybe have been used for different purposes today than they were used in the past, they still occupy a really interesting role in our lives. And that you bringing your dog across the country with you isn't a new phenomenon, or me doing the same, or if I move between continents, that's I mean, that seems crazy, and it seems like it must be a thing that only humans today are doing, right? But it's kind of more and more evident that it's not a new thing. People have been doing this for thousands of years. Where we go, our dogs go with us, and that our future dogs will be able to tell us, or our dogs now in the future will be able to tell us a lot about how we lived, right? If we find in a crazy scenario, a dog wearing a dog costume on an archaeological site, or a human costume or a Halloween costume or whatever it may be, it'll tell us a lot about how humans were living in 2021, right? It'll be different from what we were seeing in the past, but it really will show the relationship that we have now with dogs.
Very interesting.
Exactly. That's why Dr. Tatiana is here. That's why she's here. I mean, it's just interesting to think about how much we love our dogs and how much a part of our life they are. But when you compare and contrast to yesteryear, many, many yesteryears, I mean, maybe the dog didn't sleep in your bed. Maybe he slept next to you on the ground next to the fire.
We don't know.
Hunting. But that's the point. We don't know.
Hey, thank you for joining us today on the Pet Buzz.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for viewing our content on Pet Buzz Plus.